And I then we had to work together the rest of the day, and everybody obviously was very concerned for his health and well-being because, as I mentioned, he was falling apart. Uh, but I was sort of like, he's good. Don't worry about Sandy. He's more with it than he may be letting on.
Thank you for sharing that. It's today
You
would
can
be
air that or keep it in your personal archive files. It's up to you.
Well, yes. Welcome to Write for the Role, the podcast. I'm your host, John Frank Levey. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with my friends and colleagues to explore their journeys, to discover the roles they're right for, professionally and personally. As you listen, it's my greatest hope that you'll find inspiration and motivation to embrace the roles in your life you were always meant to play. And now I'd like to introduce my guest today. He's an actor, a director, a writer, a producer, an activist, and a family man. For his work over the last 3 decades, he's racked up multiple Emmy and Golden Globe Award nominations and won 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards. And speaking of honors, I have a personal one to bestow on my guest today because his audition ranks at the top of my all-time favorite casting stories. If you haven't guessed already, today I'm speaking with Noah Wyle. And since I mentioned it, I'd like to tell you about how we first met. So, I don't know if you know this part of it because it precedes when you got in my room, but your manager at the time, Eileen Feldman, I believe.
Eileen was my agent, Nancy Sanders, maybe.
Oh no! Well, then it was your agent, Eileen, who called me approximately twice a day to tell me that I had to meet you, and she was someone whose taste I respected, and I kept saying, "But Eileen, I've never seen anything he's done. I can't give him a spot in the producer's session. I have Rod Holcomb, I have John Wells, I might have Michael Crichton, for God's sake. And I don't know him. What if he came in and was terrible? And I'd waste a whole slot. And I'd be happy to see him, but he has to come in for me first." And she kept saying, he's not doing that. He's going into for producers or not at all. You're a loss if you aren't going to open up. Finally, one day she called, and I was in one of those fuck it moods. And I said, oh, for Christ's sake. And I put her on hold, and I asked Kevin Scott, who was working with me at the time, I said, pick up line 2 and give Eileen Feldman an appointment for this damn Noah Wyle. And then you came in, and it turned out to be the one day that Crichton was in the room. And I remember it this way, and I've read a little bit about your memory of it, and I think we have a slightly different memory. I remember walking out into the hallway to greet you and welcome you, and you saying to me, I'm happy to read the 2 scenes that you've assigned us, but I want to do another scene as well. And I said, really? And I thought to myself, ugh, this kid has a great idea, which is never a great idea. And you told me what the scene was, and it was the blood draw scene. And you came in and you immediately took over the audition. You put me in the chair that was meant for you, and you took a retractable pencil out of your pocket and proceeded to screw up blood draw over and over and over again. It was a scene with no dialogue, and Crichton, I think I've exaggerated this part, but Crichton was laughing so hard that his 6'9" body fell off the couch he was sitting on, and I think you got the job right then.
Let's go with your memory.
Because it's true, or because you don't remember?
Well, it's wonderfully flattering, and I mean, it's funny. I do remember it slightly differently, but that's what 30 some odd years will do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I recall coming in twice. I recall coming in to read for you and maybe Rod and maybe John, and then getting called back to test at the network against Raphael Sbarge. And Are you talking about the very first audition that
I'm talking about the very first audition, and you did read twice, once for us and once for the network, because we started a test deal on you about 8 minutes after you left the room.
I remember the second one way more than the first. I remember the first one was just trying to get to the second, and I wanted to come in and just uh, get to the final round. But I have very little recollection of it. Oddly
Okay.
enough, what I do remember about it is because this is going to date the story. I just finished reading that book, The Celestine Prophecy, and I was all about control dramas and trying to recognize what somebody's energy was so that it didn't affect my energy. And that was a big part of auditioning at the time, was to try to figure out how to create a sense of privacy or a sense of quiet when you were sitting in a bullpen of actors who wanted nothing more than to sabotage your peace and quiet. Uh, and I just remember sitting there outside your casting office over at Warner Brothers, very aware of everybody else's energy and trying to very much stay focused on my own. But the second audition, again, we went to network, where I felt that that Michael was incredibly gracious and kind and gave me this lovely distraction to let me relax and go in the room and do my best work.
You know, when we were doing some research, and you said the words, I went in after Crichton helped you to focus and relax and center. You went in and got your job. What was it about John Carter that made you feel it was a role you were right for?
Well, right off the bat, I identified with him being born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and it never quite fitting for him. That it was an ill-fitted spoon, and he was a blue-blooded character, sort of a waspy, rich kid who was doing his rotation in the nastiest hospital, that he could possibly do it. And it wasn't written that he was disgusted or turned off. It was written that he was trying to make good and trying to make these people like him and think he was smart and trying to fit in. And I started thinking that this is closer to like Henry IV Part One, right? He's
Uh-huh.
he's he's going to be king, but he needs to prove himself with the vagabonds and the thieves and the pickpockets and the drunks. He needs to fall under the tutelage of people who have real life experience, who have been touched and hurt and scarred by life. And then when he's marinated in that long enough, if he's proven himself and is metal enough, he will become the physician and the man that he really aspires to be, which is somebody who can accept the responsibilities of his birthright, but not have misgivings that he hadn't earned them, that he'd been out in the world enough to accept the mantle of power and responsibility based on experience and wisdom. So that was sort of, I don't know that I articulated it all back then in that way, but as the show progressed, that became more and more sort of my arc, is that this guy's going to one day run this place, but it's going to be a really long arc to get there. And that's what was so sexy about the characters. Dr. Green, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Ross, those all started off as already proficient physicians who were experts in their fields. Carter was the screw up, and he was the goofy one and the clumsy one. So the curve, the arc ahead of that character was so much larger than the rest of them. And it afforded a lot of opportunities for comedy and physical comedy, which you know, it's something I really love doing. I wanted it really badly. And as you probably remember, that was the first TV show I ever auditioned for. And the reason Eileen was being such a stickler about it back then was I was being a stickler about not wanting to do TV and sign long-term contracts. I really wanted to be in movies and plays and keep my schedule open, and variety being the spice of my life. And look what happened.
You know, it's interesting because I've often thought to myself, if you or I or anybody else who auditioned for ER who got the job could thought to themselves, this is a how many I don't know how many dollars eventually were part of the equation, um, or how much opportunity for growth and change as an artist and as a person. You know, it's interesting because I think Dr. Carter was our eyes and ears as we went into the world that we didn't know anything about. and we had the same long arc that you had, and you always represented the audience and the rest of us. And I always thought that was fascinating. But can you imagine how much pressure you would put on yourself if you thought this audition could make me a very rich man?
Gratefully, that wasn't the metric that I measured my ambition by back then, and gratefully, because of VR, it still isn't. But
Yeah. No,
I
it's fantastic that I mean, on a very minor level, I'm semi-retired, although I would still be enjoying to do something, and I am doing some things. But fortunately, I don't have to do CSI Toledo if even if it were offered to me. When Trudy and I put out the book, Right for the Role, which is the basis of this conversation, um, I asked a lot of writers, actors, directors to write a little blurb, and I asked many of them. I used the phrase "a few sentences," and almost nobody understood that concept, but you did. But you talked a little bit about the diversity in the cast of ER, and you said that I was greatly responsible for that, which I am
I'll
very
repeat it
flattered.
here. I'll repeat it live so you can hear it from my own lips. I believe that to be true. I believe that that was the most diverse and inclusive cast that had ever been on television to that point, and with very few exceptions since. It was it was orchestrated and intentional to make it feel authentic to what Cook County emergency room would have looked like if you broke it down ethnically and ages and body types and everything else. So you were pulling from reality, but at the time, nobody else was doing anything close to that.
Yeah,
And because it
I'm
was so
very proud of that.
successful,
In truth, as you look back at it, um, if that pilot were being made today, more than Eriq would have been a person of color
sure,
by a lot. And it was in what I call the trampoline, the support cast, that we were able to, and the patient cast, where we were able to do diversity before it was a mandate, and it was organic to the story and to the environment, and I think it was one of the things that helped us separate us from the competition of Chicago Hope, which aired the same night we did, and who I am proud to say we trounced, because our show made stars and their show employed stars, and so our show was fresh and their show was stale.
there were so many differences between them. The pace and the varied storylines that didn't have a traditional beginning and middle and end structure to them. The cases themselves, the storylines we delved into, it was all very novel. But I give you a tremendous amount of credit. You and Guy B and Rod Holcomb.
Oh, really? That's great. I'm happy to be in that company. I miss Rod.
I do too.
um,
For those of you who don't know, Rod Holcomb directed the pilot, the 100th episode, and the finale, for which he
that's
won
correct.
the Emmy. And
And
was
I first met him when he directed the pilot of China Beach, which is also where I first became part of that team, which went on to change my life. Um, one of the things that was wonderful about ER was that it was a community and it was an ensemble. And I don't know, I played sports as a kid, and then I was a hippie in the '60s, as you've described your mother as also a hippie. I'm happy to have not met her in those days. That would be embarrassing. Um, but that whole sense of community and collaboration is at the forefront of everything that I care about and believe in. And I think it is for you as well. Can you speak about where that comes from in you?
probably coming from a large family, first and foremost, putting on plays with my cousins and my siblings, and everything always being sort of group activity oriented when I was a kid. Um, that said, I've always felt a little bit of a of a loner and somebody who kind of goes against the grain. So I'm not naturally a joiner. I'm not naturally somebody who likes to be in groups. But an ensemble is different than a group. You know, an ensemble doesn't ascribe itself to any fixed set of ideas or dogmas. Ideally, it is a living, breathing organism that is all about exploration and creativity and trust. And if you get in the right ensemble with the right group of people and you feel that trust and you feel that freedom to explore and ask difficult questions and reveal parts of yourself that most times you would never ever reveal, it's a transcendent experience, you know. And if the work is good, if the words are good and it's in a good architecture, you can really achieve something phenomenal. So there's always been an ideal which I aim for, and I so rarely ever hit it. None of us ever really rarely hit it. We're lucky if we hit it once or twice in a lifetime. And you've hit it several times. I've hit it a couple times. And I consider myself extremely fortunate in that regard because those are the most creatively satisfying endeavors that make the richest memories for sure.
Absolutely. Not only rich memories, but real springboards for your own personal growth and the capacity to change and become a participant in everybody's excellence. Some people have said, and I think actually you did as well, that I changed their life. And I prefer to think of it as we changed our lives together. Um, and
Yes, but I didn't get to
that's
cast
very
you.
moving to me.
I didn't get to cast you, John.
Well, someone else did. Um,
Well, then we all can pay it upwards, right? Pay it forwards.
Absolutely. What was it about that large blended family that you grew up in that made you think about a creative life?
Well, my family have all, you know, are all in the arts in one degree or another. My grandmother was a painter and founded the Crafted Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles, and both of my aunts are painters, and many of my cousins are painters, and my uncle was a fairly well-known painter. My mother had been a theater major in college. My father grew up in LA. My grandmother was born in LA. So being in and around our business was something that I was extremely familiar with. It wasn't a foreign concept to me that you could have a life in the arts. But you know, I found it probably through the competition at the dinner table. I was not the best athlete. I was not the best student. I, you know, didn't know how to stand out or claim my own area, but I could be funny and I could tell stories. And when I got into high school, you know, and I did my first play and I got complimented for it, that felt really great, you know. And I
Yeah.
kind of chased the validation high of somebody telling me I was good at something or telling me I could be even better at something all the way into the career I now have. I don't know that I put that much more thought into it, except for certain things turn me off, certain things turn me on. And doing creative work and somehow feeling that play could be work was really attractive.
You know, one of the things that I found really interesting when we were researching you, which is a weird concept, but true, was that the famous episodes that took place in Africa led to some activism on your part in the arena of Doctors Without Borders and other stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how your activism was born and what kind of things you're caring deeply about these days?
Um, it was born early, you know. I think growing up in a sort of liberal Jewish household, by and large, lends you to a sense of philanthropy, a sense of worldliness, a sense of responsibility. And so my family was always looking out for ways to be of service to communities that were struggling, whether it was at the holiday time or, you know, my mom worked at Kaiser Hospital in Los Angeles, and she was always mentoring somebody. We were always having somebody sleep in our house. It was always, you know, we have, so let's give. That was the mentality. So, and I remember when I was in fourth or fifth grade, there was a telethon to end world hunger, if you can imagine. I think it had to do with the famine in Ethiopia at the time. And it hit me at a very young and impactful moment that there was great inequality in the world, great suffering, and that, you know, for what was not a lot of money, not a lot of sacrifice, you can make a difference. That was sort of the pitch. And I've just sort of believed that, I believe that it doesn't take very much to be a good person. It doesn't take very much to make a difference in somebody else's life. It just takes a sense of intention and looking out for it and holding it as a value. Um, the Africa storylines, it actually was the other way around. Because I was on ER, I was always being approached by various charities and organizations to be a spokesperson. And there was this group called Doctors of the World, which was an American-based version of Doctors Without Borders that was based out of New York. And they were running all these really interesting clinics and campaigns all over the world, trying to do sort of frontline triage medicine. And they invited me during the war in Kosovo to come and be an observer in Skopje, Macedonia, where they were running two of the largest refugee camps of Kosovar Albanians crossing the border. So I went, and it was, one of those eye-opening, jaw-dropping experiences where you're suddenly in a refugee camp with 10,000 people, and it's mostly women and children, and everybody is dehydrated and injured and terrified, and they're being treated by 6 or 7 American doctors who left their family practices in Ohio or Illinois to come and fly halfway around the world to treat these people with a card table worth of supplies. I mean, nothing. But they were giving palliative care, and they were giving empathy care, and they were giving psychological care, and they were just bearing witness. And I came back just fucking galvanized, that this was really important. And the work that these doctors were doing would be a great thing for Carter to get involved with, because it was so in keeping with his trajectory of activism and allyship. So, and also his sort of desire to keep putting himself in harm's way and keep testing himself in more and more extreme situations. So all of that felt hand in glove. And I thought those were amazing storylines, and kind of the most gratifying ones that I was involved with. I loved shooting the stuff in the Belgian Congo episodes, and I loved doing the Darfur storyline as well.
Me too. Just jumping back to the question of diversity a little bit, you described Carter's relationship with Benton as a love story, and you also have talked about it as, very much the opposite racial dynamic. When I talked with Eriq recently, he and I talked about race quite a bit, and I have always felt that he didn't get enough credit for representing a Black professional on television. Not only did we have diversity on ER, but a Black man in those days was mostly playing pimps and cops and drug dealers and like that. And I always felt that the relationship between Carter and Benton was so important. And I'm never quite sure that the primarily white writing staff understood what they had created.
I couldn't agree more. And I've said several times that I thought Eriq deserved more credit than he got for being on the vanguard, the front tip of the spear in representation. And it wasn't just that he was a competent and excellent Black doctor. There may have been other shows that did that. It was the way that Eriq carries himself as a man and the way that he approached that role in particular that made it different. And, there were many, many times where I didn't understand what he was doing, where I didn't get where his unwillingness to just take everything at face value, his unwillingness to just go with the flow. He really, I remember vividly, doing publicity, and he just had a very particular way that he wanted to carry himself, and it didn't always. We kept sort of thinking, like, "Come on, Eriq, what's the problem?" And it's only in retrospect that I have subsequently apologized for my ignorance and naivete, as I realized that he was representing something so different than what we were doing. He mattered in a much larger way than any of our characters did culturally. And he felt the responsibility of that and carried it into each and every scene he played. Whether I got that or not, at the time, I get it now. And I give him a lot of credit for it. In terms of our relationship, I think the writers wrote towards the strengths that we were showing. I played into that character needed to tell me that I was good. If that character could anoint me, then that would be my graduation ceremony. Even more than the diploma, Benton's validation meant the most to Carter.
Well,
And
Benton's validation gave Carter permission to validate himself.
100%. And when Carter had the drug addiction storyline and Benton was there, and Carter got stabbed and Benton was there. Uh, he was always there in the significant ways that showed the depth of his feeling for Carter, but he never articulated it in or never showed it in any way that Carter could appreciate, but the audience got to see it. And that
Yeah.
was very sophisticated writing, to have me just saying, love me, love me, love me, think I'm good, and him saying no. But then
Yeah.
being there to make sure that I stayed on my track and stayed on my trajectory and got to where I was going. It's beautiful.
You got an opportunity to work with a lot of different actors over all those years. Are there some stories of some particular actors? I kind of want you to tell the Sandy Meisner story,
Oh
but
my God.
that could be one we
That's
would
safe to
cut if
tell
you
now.
wanted to. What?
Uh, well, thanks to you and the writing staff, Carter got a lot of the elderly patients that came through the ER, which meant that Noah got to work with some of the great veteran actors that have been in our business. And it began early on with, John Randolph
Oh
and
my God. Excuse
uh,
me for interrupting you, but that's when I knew that we were onto something. When John Randolph sang that Old Black Magic to his dying wife and kissed her eyes, I thought, damn, this is storytelling.
yeah, or Eli Wallach, doing the
Oh,
same thing with Anne, or Alan Alda, or Mickey Rooney, or Red Buttons.
yeah,
These guys were giants in the industry uh, when their careers began, and they were coming in to basically swing it one last time, and
yeah.
and did they swing? And I got very close with Red. I got very close with Alan Alda. I got, Eli and I went on and did a play together. So those were relationships that I couldn't have been more grateful for. I sat at the knee and asked all the questions and heard all the stories and just gobbled them up. Ernest Borgnine. I mean,
Oh
the
God.
list goes on and on and on. And Rosemary Clooney, Rosemary and I had an amazing experience together. I think George was actually jealous of the intimacy that I had with Rosemary that he'd been looking for his whole life, and that we
Uh-huh.
had in those 8 days. Uh,
One of the great
Magical.
contributions that my partner here, Trudy Roth, made to the book is that we listed every actor who was in ER over the 15 years. And it is, I was there for everybody who moaned or groaned or cried or screamed, spoke or prayed. And I didn't remember a hell of a lot of them.
Oh,
It,
I
it,
get it all the time. A friend of mine texted me the other day and said Jessica Chastain says hello. I said I don't know Jessica Chastain. She says you're her doctor,
uh-huh.
and then she sends a picture. And apparently I was. I just didn't remember.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we made a holding deal with Jessica when she came out of Juilliard, and she did a a shot on ER, and then she did a pilot that never saw the light of day, called Dark Shadows. It was a remake of the '50s
Sure.
show. Um, you talked to also, I thought it was interesting because I never knew this,
Do you
that
want
you
me to
had a
tell the Sandy story? I'll tell the Sandy story if you really want to hear it, because I can't say no to you.
well, I just think it's funny as hell, but only if it doesn't make you uncomfortable.
No, it doesn't make me uncomfortable. In a sense, it is a story about something that we have gone and made a lot of policy around now, but I told it as a bit of an anecdote, and I'll tell it in that way now. So Sanford Meisner, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most venerated acting teachers of the 20th century. He, along with Harold Clurman and Stella Adler, and started and um,
The group theater.
the group theater. But why am I blanking on his name? Lee Strasberg.
Yeah, Strasbourg.
They started the group theater together, and Sandy was, I think, 97 at the time that we employed him. And at that point, he had had throat cancer and had his larynx removed, and he had used a voice box to communicate, which he could still no longer use. So he had a hole in his throat, and the only way he could understand what he was saying was to listen to the air coming out of his throat and to kind of read his lips. And it made it kind of sound like that when he would talk like that.
Sort of pre-Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yes. He had one functioning eye, one functioning lung. He had fluid in his legs and his arms that were swelling them up, twice the size. He had lesions. He was being fed through through a gastric tube. The man was in bad shape. Nonetheless, he wanted to come on the show, and we had a beautiful part for him. And I was going to play his doctor, and I was thrilled. And the first day we worked together, he had a kind of handler named Jimmy that brought him around and took care of him, kind of a Santa Claus looking guy. And all the scenes that we played on the first day were the intimate scenes in the exam room where I'm reading Walt Whitman poetry and we're trying to find his son. And every once in a while, he would look at me with this intensity that just sent shivers up my spine, and it was thrilling. And then other times his attention and his mind seemed to wander, and and the director, Chris Chulak, would sort of bring him back on. And every once in a while, he'd get nervous and he'd go, "Where's Jimmy?" And I'd say, "Oh, Jimmy, I think Sandy needs you." And Jimmy would come in and attend to him. And if Jimmy wasn't there, I was very attentive and brought him water and, held his hand. And I just couldn't believe I was spending my day with this giant. I even posed for a Polaroid picture, with my arm around him. And I went home just on this high that I had worked with Sandy Meisner. And then he came back 5 days later to shoot a second scene. And Jimmy pulled up in the car outside the soundstage, and he said, "Noah, would you take Sandy into the room we have for him while I parked the car?" And I said, "Sure." So I put Sanford Meisner in a wheelchair, and I wheeled him into this room, the exam room we had on the set for him. And I pulled up a chair, kind of a rolling stool across from him. And I said, "Sandy, I just have to tell you that was one of the highlights of my life working with you the other day." And everybody said that the work we did was just terrific. They saw the dailies. Today is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be shooting the trauma scenes, which can get a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more frenetic. So if you need anything, please let me know. I'll be there like I was the other day. And he kind of looks at me and nods. And then he gets this kind of funny look, and he says, "Where's Jimmy?" And I said, "Jimmy just went to go park the car. Jimmy will be back in a couple of minutes, but if there's anything you need, I'm here." And he reaches over and he puts his hand on my shoulder. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. So I put my hand on his shoulder. And so we're just sort of holding shoulders and looking at each other. And then he puts his other hand on my knee, and I don't put my hand on his knee, but I'm looking at him. And he starts to pull me in like he's going to tell me a secret. And in my young egocentric mind, I thought, he's going to pay me a compliment. He's going to tell me that I remind him of a young Clift. He's going to tell me that he would love to continue to teach, and that I'm the kind of. And then as I'm thinking these thoughts, I'm realizing he's pulling me in for a kiss. And that 97-year-old tongue starts to come out, and that hand that's on my knee starts to go up my thigh. And now we're sort of in a kind of like a little bit of a lock where I'm pulling away and he's pulling in, I'm pulling away and he's pulling in. And it's really awkward. And I finally get a burst of strength and just sort of push back in my rolly stool, which sends me all the way across the room. And now we're looking at each other. And I don't know what to say. And I don't know why I said it, but he's sitting there like this. And he was wearing this beautiful antique Rolex watch. And I said, "That's a nice watch." And then he starts to take off the watch like I've just sort of quoted a price or struck a bargain. And I go, "No, no, 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 no. I'm not saying I want your watch. I don't want your watch. I was just saying it was." And as I'm fumbling over saying I didn't want his watch, Jimmy walked in, and I thought, "Oh, great. Well, Jimmy's here." And that's that. And I went back out to my trailer, and subsequently found out that Jimmy was not his handler, but Jimmy was his lover, that Sandy was gay, and Sandy was sort of notorious for preying on students throughout his career. And I thought about that first day where I had held his hand and pressed my cheek against his and taken Polaroids and been so obsequious and thought, oh, that could be seen as flirting, I guess. And I then we had to work together the rest of the day, and everybody obviously was very concerned for his health and well-being because, as I mentioned, he was falling apart. Uh, but I was sort of like, he's good. Don't worry about Sandy. He's more with it than he may be letting on.
Thank you for sharing that. It's today
You
would
can air
be.
that or keep it in your personal archive files. It's up to you.
Well, yes, and you're quite right that in today's world, I've been a flirt since I was 2, and I've had to stop flirting uh, completely because it's a weird world nowadays. I hate having my picture taken. I always have. I'm so uncomfortable being the center of attention, I guess, that I always make funny faces. And there's a famous picture of me as a hippie with an orange traffic cone on my head. Imagine that. When it came time to have a picture taken for the flap of my memoir, Right for the Role, I was introduced to a photographer named Eusebio Hernandez. And he made me feel so comfortable and relaxed that we got a great shot. If you're looking for headshots, I strongly recommend that you contact Eusebio Hernandez, and his contact information is available on the show notes. Did you guys feel like heroes on ER?
During the pandemic?
No, during when you were. I think we became aware again of the heroism of the medical world and the selflessness. To the not to the extreme of the doctors that you encountered in Africa, but in general, was that
Well,
part of?
it's tricky. I when we made that show, emergency medicine as a medical discipline was sort of the bastard stepchild. Nobody ranked ER medicine very highly. Nobody funded it very well. And the people who practiced it were considered kind of the cowboys and mavericks of the medical world because they were adrenaline junkies who liked, intensity and an open schedule. So they oftentimes, played in rock bands or had extreme sports as hobbies. And they weren't really taken seriously as a discipline. And then our show came on the air, and as a discipline, it blew up. Suddenly there were a lot more people applying to go into emergency medicine. The candidates that were applying were of a higher caliber. And because they were of a higher caliber, they were doing a lot more research. The research led to a lot more funding, which led to a lot more procedures being done in the emergency room, whether it was radiology or, minor surgery, things that used to be under the auspices of other departments then became centralized in emergency rooms at the very same moment that emergency rooms became the primary source of healthcare for most Americans who were without insurance and using them as GP visits. So it was this weird confluence of population explosion on both sides. And that lasted for about 30, 25 years until the pandemic. And then the pandemic, everybody may have been banging pots for the heroism of the people on the front lines that were saving our lives, but the ranks of applicants dropped.
Hmm.
It was no longer a sexy specialty. It looked like you were signing up for a death wish. And in addition to that, the people that had been in those jobs were basically doing tours of duty in a war zone without any relief and without ever rotating out. So not only were there less applicants, but the burnout rate was extreme. The things that those people had to do and see and participate in is unbelievable still to this day. And so this project I'm engaged in now is born out of a desire to shine the spotlight back on this community, which picks up our broken pieces daily without much thanks or without much pay. But my appreciation for them and my acknowledgement of what heroes they are began 30 years ago when I saw, when we would go down to ERs and you just see, oh, these are the doctors that treat the population that nobody else will treat. These are the doctors that treat you in the middle of the night or on holidays, or, and all they do is attend to everybody's worst day of their life, and
Yeah,
over and
absolutely.
over and over again. So, my personal, I don't feel nearly as heroic as the people that do it. I've tried in both of these projects to do my duty to give them the honor and respect they deserve, and everybody should should pay them the debt of gratitude that is owed.
I completely agree. Noah, the thing that's among the many things that's remarkable about you is that you've been on television for most of the last 30 years. Not just the long run of ER, but significant runs on other shows where you've become a writer and a director and a producer. What keeps you driven and interested in working that hard?
I'll confess that I'm extremely selfish when it comes to my work, and as much as people may enjoy it, I really do it for myself and my own mental health. I like having a place to go every day to be creative. I like being with creative people and working on material that's relevant. Um, I don't know. The two hardest periods of time in my adult life were the pandemic and the strike. The pandemic, suddenly I couldn't find any way of being useful. I couldn't figure out which of my skills were necessary, in that world. And I was really depressed. I didn't know quite how to contribute. Uh, and then the strike, 192 days to think about the fragility of our industry and how it's not a birthright. It's a real privilege to be able to go to work every day and have a job. It's a real privilege to be able to help 150 other people go to work every day and have a job and feed their families in really uncertain and difficult times. So work as as a sort of like engine for ambition and personal aggrandizement got reframed completely during those periods of time where I looked at work as necessity and work as livelihood and work as mental health and work as community building and all those sort of other things that I was craving and needing in my life. And when I went back to work on the show Leverage Redemption, one of the first productions back in the pandemic, we wrote the protocol papers on how to do production during a pandemic in zones and tiers and distances. As hard as that was, it was the best I felt, that year. So I will continue to do it because I don't think that I'm a very good version of myself when I'm not doing it.
Fascinating. One of the other major roles in your life and in mine is the role of father. Uh, it's remarkable. My oldest, who you probably remember, Oliver, um, I discovered when we were digging into you that you two are only about 5 or 6 or 7 years apart. Uh, he's now in his mid to late 40s and working in post production at Amazon and being an activist. My youngest lives in Denver, and I think you've met her actually through Alex Ela, who she had a relationship with for quite some time.
Yes.
Sadly, that ended. Um, she's a special ed teacher in Denver.
Well,
What are your kids up to?
today, ironically enough, is my son's 22nd birthday.
Wow.
He is in Boston, going to college at Boston University. My daughter Auden is 19, and much like her father at 19, is embarking on an acting career and just booked a movie that she just shot and is living independently and trying to make a go of it. And then I have a 9-year-old daughter, Frances, who's just on the other side of that wall watching television and in fourth grade, and is
Yes.
they're just, that is, I have a little bit of a daily gratitude practice where I try to identify the things that I'm most grateful for, and those kids make the top of the list every day.
I'll bet. Well, no, it's just such an honor and a privilege to get back in touch with you. I have one more thing I want to ask you about, and it's purely selfish.
Lay it on me.
When I was a kid, my mom used to say to my brother and I, describe yourself in 3 words. Would you do that for us?
Mm,
Don't
three
think too
words.
much.
Uh, 3 words to describe myself. Curious, tolerant, creative.
Fabulous. Such a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
What were your words? And just
When
like,
I was at 7,
yeah,
I said, I'm me, I'm Johnny, and I'm a boy. I had no identity issue.
apparently not. You're still you, and you're still Johnny, and you're still a boy.
Thank you.